Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Strand bookstore. My name is Peter, and I help direct the events here. For a little bit of history, Strand was founded in 1927 by the Bass family over on what was then 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled until after over 92 years, Strand is the sole survivor, still run by the Bass family, and still housing new and used books. Tonight, I am very excited to hear from the Democracy Collaborative's co-founder and president, Ted Howard, and senior fellow and executive vice president, Marjorie Kelly, all about their brand new book, The Making of a Democratic Economy. Here to say a little bit more about the project and kick things off is J. Philip Thompson, MIT professor and author of Double Trouble, Black Mayors, Black Communities, and the Struggle for Deep Democracy, who has served in the Manhattan Borough President's Office as well as in multiple mayoral administrations. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming him to the Strand.
Right. So I first want to thank Marjorie and Ted for doing this book because I think it's timely and, at a time when people in the country really, I think a lot of the anxiety in the country is like, what is the future? And I have 3 boys in their 20s, and all of them are like, we have no idea what our lives are going to be like. And I think that's true of like so many people, that there's an anxiety. And I think this book actually it works in that space. It helps to provide some vision, some direction, a hopeful direction of where things might go. I also think that economic democracy really is the original American dream. And people like Thomas Jefferson and Madison, others, believe that, they believe that people who voted actually should own property. And if not land, if they work for a company, they should own part of the company where they worked. And they believe that because they said people, when they go to work every day, they learn how to make decisions, work with others, take responsibilities for decisions that they make. And if you don't learn that every day and practice it every day in your daily economic life, when you go to vote, you'll make bad decisions because you won't have experience and real knowledge of what it means, to run something. Now, of course, we all know the bad side of that, which is like non-property holding white men, were excluded. They knew that was a contradiction too. And one of the reasons why the original American dream kind of floundered, and people like Kosciuszko, there's a bridge here named after him, the Polish revolutionary, played a huge role in the American Revolution. He never gave up on that dream. Neither did Thomas Paine, who was buried in New Rochelle. 4 people went to his funeral. 4. But one of the reasons these folks fell out of favor is because they ran up against the slaveocracy. And the slave owner said, we can't extend democracy into our main industry, which is cotton and slavery. It doesn't make sense. And so there was this pushback right from the beginning. But the impulse was for economic democracy. It makes sense. I would say the Civil War, same thing. 13th Amendment, if you go back and read the debates leading up to the 13th Amendment, it prohibited not only chattel slavery, but involuntary servitude. Involuntary servitude in 1863 meant what they called then wage slavery. They said if someone has to go work for another person because they have no other means of survival, that's not voluntary. That's involuntary. And the 13th Amendment prohibited that. And the idea of Salmon Chase and many of the other abolitionist advocates, people, the ideal was to actually 40 acres and a mule, land redistribution. It was going back to this notion that everyone ought to have a stake in the economy in order to have a healthy democracy, and that ought to be guaranteed in law. And in fact, they put it in the Constitution. Then the Constitution was overthrown at the end of Reconstruction violently. Black people couldn't vote for another 100 years. Lots of massacres in order to block this kind of economic democracy, and so on. I could talk in the same way about the New Deal and about the Civil Rights Movement, which at heart was also about economic transformation. And it's interesting how all of this history gets buried and reconfigured, but I believe economic democracy speaks to the true American dream, which has been an aspiration of the American people since the beginning. I would also say that one of the chapters in the book I noted was inclusion. The very model of capitalism is premised on women doing work that doesn't make profits. It's premised on that. If you go back and read Adam Smith and all of that, it's never been profitable raising children, taking care of sick people, elderly people, disabled people. That's never been profitable. And so that was women's work. It was actually not considered when people were thinking about markets. It was assumed that women would do that work for free. And if women weren't doing the work, of course, you would have slaves to do that work. And now that we don't have slaves and now that we don't have segregation, we have undocumented workers who we bring here to do exactly that work. Because in our model of capitalism and our model of markets, we have never, ever really come to grips with what it means to have women and people of color, marginalized people, fully included in the economy. And that is the block to economic democracy today. That is truly it. What does it mean? How will child care, how will senior care actually get paid for so those jobs have dignity? You know, restaurant work, so those jobs have dignity. I'm deputy mayor now of New York. Peter didn't mention that. So one of the things we're working on is how do we embed economic democracy into New York City policy now? How do we actually build an ecosystem? And I'll just mention it's challenging. Folks don't know what we're talking about. I have study groups in City Hall. You know, we're like, Ted spoke at one. It's like, people are like, what the hell are you talking about? And so, you know, there are a lot of approaches. How do we build co-ops? There are opportunities to do that with what's left of manufacturing in New York and other sectors as well. How do we popularize community ownership through things like land trusts or microgrids and other things? How do we actually finance these kinds of new forms of business? It's not familiar to the banks and intermediaries, financial intermediaries now. How do we actually build an ecosystem to finance that? And how do we do popular education? So, the Department of Ed and Richard Carranza, who's with me on this stuff, we're sitting down and saying, how do we embed economic democracy into the curriculum for 1.1 million school kids? How we're putting it into our summer youth training programs, where this summer we have 2,000 young people in a democracy corps. And next summer to be 10,000, and we're training them in the principles of democracy, economic democracy, and then organizing so they can do projects in the summer that connect to these themes. So we're trying on all these different fronts, but it's a race against time. We have 2.5 years. Our staff is working hard at it, but we need books like this, and we need allies and friends like you all to help move New York forward, and we think help move the country forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Phil. That was great. Thank you for coming out. Yeah, it's a thrill for me to be here at the Strand. This is really one of my very favorite stores in the country. And it's no accident that this store is owned by human beings, right? It's locally owned. It's very different from, there's an Amazon store, an actual brick and mortar Amazon store in Boston where I live. And you go in there and it feels like it was an algorithm stocked that store, and probably did. And that's where most of our economy has gone. Ownership by remote means, and not locally owned or broadly owned. So why did we write this book? I, as a journalist, have been tracking alternative economics, different kinds of impact investing and employee ownership, and different kinds of economic development for about 30 years. And Democracy Collaborative has been around for 20 years. We do this kind of work all over the country, and it's still largely invisible. We talk so much about what capital is doing and what Wall Street is doing, and we miss, there's a lot of creative and sophisticated work. This is really highly developed. And And so we wrote this book to say, where is the democratic economy being built? That's a phrase that is not yet in wide use. Sometimes people call it the new economy. But we think by calling it the democratic economy, it does, as Phil said, it reclaims the best of America. It reclaims really what we're about as a country. And we go on journeys in the book to tell some stories about where is this emerging and what does it mean if we actually had a democratic economy that was designed for the prosperity of all of us. So Ted, you want to take it away a little bit there?
Sure. Let me get this up. So we're going to actually talk about some of the stories in the book, because probably 85% of the book, maybe more, is really storytelling. And it's an effort to change the narrative we have around the economy. But I wanted to just share with you two things that happened to me this morning that really points to why we wrote the book. One is this morning at 5 a.m., I was interviewed by The Guardian in the United Kingdom. 5 a.m. was not my choice, but it was the one time that worked for the journalist. And he's doing a full 2-page story on inequality, wealth inequality, all over the world, but particularly in the United Kingdom. So I was one of the many, many people he's interviewing. And we went through all the data and the consolidation of wealth and what's happened since Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan ushered in the neoliberal consensus, and how that was built out of the Chicago School and Milton Friedman's thinking, and then what's happened since the crisis, the what we call in the United States the recession of 10 years ago, they call in Europe the crisis, and how 95% of the income gains have gone to the 1%, and even though the president likes to say that we've got the greatest economy in the history of the world and the most growth and the GDP's up and the stock market said all full-time, high, and the next week it goes higher. Why is it that 3 people in America own as much wealth as the bottom 160 million? So we went through all that, and he then asked the question, well, what do you think could be done about this? Do you think, should we raise taxes? And that was one of the reasons we wrote the book, because our argument is there is something at the very heart of this system that is generating the outcomes that we're seeing consistently. It's not an aberration. I had a lot more love in my heart for President Obama than for this president, and yet wealth inequality went up under Obama as well as under Trump, and it went up under Bush and Clinton and Bush 1 and on and on and on. So we wanted to say, yes, it's important to elect the right people and policy is important, but we need to realize we have a systemic crisis, the very design of the system. And if we don't address that, as we say in the book, it's like putting a picket fence in front of a bulldozer. We're not going to get there. So that was one thing this morning that reminded me why we wrote the book. And the second was I was seeing an old friend who his office is on a very high floor in the Empire State Building. Hadn't seen him in a number of years. Very successful business person, advises CEOs of Fortune 500 corporations. And I'd sent him the book and said, I'm going to be in New York City and I'd love to sit down with you. And he read it. And he actually didn't disagree with anything in the book. It was quite interesting. One profound thing he said to me was, I just can see no way at all that capitalism has any shot of addressing escalating inequality. It is just not set up to do that. And he says, I would like it to do that, but it's just not going to do that. And he also said, in our he defines himself as in the belly of the beast of capitalism. So he is right at the heart of the matter. And he said, in our corporate world, we talk about extraction, but we only mean extracting natural resources and doing something with them to create value for shareholders. But you in this book designate the entire economy that we have as an extractive economy. It's systematically, while it's generating productivity and wealth, it is systematically extracting it out of our communities out of families and individuals and consolidating it ever more. And for him, that was kind of a light bulb. It was a whole new way of looking. And that's one of the reasons we wrote the book. We wanted to name what's going on now as an extractive economy and start to delegitimize it. All these myths that people know, and not probably the people in this room, because I had the opportunity to introduce myself to a lot of you. But in general, I live in Cleveland, Ohio, and in general, people believe, well, if the GDP is growing, it's got to be good for us. And if we just grow a lot, it'll trickle down. And a rising tide lifts all boats. And all these things that have just become the accepted part of how we see the economy, we want to rip that away and actually delegitimize what this economy is about and counterpose to the extractive economy and name something new a democratic economy. And so that is the hope, that we can plant a flag around a new definition of a moral and democratic economy based on demonstrably different principles than the extractive economy, and that is intentionally designed to produce outcomes that everybody in this room would want. Environmental rationality and sustainability, greater equality, greater stability of our communities, greater inclusion and racial equity in our system. So I just want to share, that's how my day's been today, along with sweltering and sweating on the streets of New York City. Marjorie?
Yeah, so let me tell you one of the stories. Ted and I had the good fortune to work on Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, and this is one of the most beat up places in the country. They estimate unemployment at Pine Ridge is as high as 80%. So you go to this place and people aren't working. There's no place to spend money. They say that $1 enters Pine Ridge, and every time it enters, it leaves within 48 hours. You simply can't spend money there. So we had the good fortune to work with a young man whose name is Nick Tilson. He was in his 30s, and Nick was a young person who was part of a youth group that was reviving spiritual practices on Pine Ridge. There were some Native American practices that had been illegal for quite some time. And Nick said, when we were in ceremony, we received a message from the elders. And the message was, how long will you let someone else determine the fate of your children? Are you not warriors? And he said they came out of that and they realized that they needed to act. And they formed a community development corporation, which is separate from tribal government, because almost everything happening on reservations is happening through tribal government. That's the only, it's the only actor. So they started this independent CDC called Thunder Valley, and they went around and they went on a listening tour. They spent hundreds of hours listening to people, because and natives told him, he's a Lakota Sioux, and his fellow Lakota told him, no one had ever asked us before, what is it that you need? What is it that you want? What could we build in this community that would really help you? There was no place to buy a house anywhere on Pine Ridge. It simply could not. There was no house for sale. So one of the things they heard is that we need homes. People were living 3 families, 2 broken down trailers. And so they created this vision of what they call a regenerative community. And the idea is, it's a planned community. They're going to build homes for sale. They're going to build rental spaces. There'll be powwow grounds. There'll be youth skateboard parks and places for small business. They're going to generate all of their own electricity. All the houses are placed for maximum solar. They're going to recycle all of their own water. They have youth. They're training youth in construction skills as they build homes, because they're not. One of the things we talk about is building community wealth. You're not just building financial wealth. You're building lots of wealth. What kind of skills are they? What kind of ecosystem is there? What are the different kinds of wealth that are being built? They created an employee-owned construction company. That was something that we were helping them with. One of the women we worked with there, Sharice Davids, she was the deputy director. She went back to Kansas City, and she became one of the first Native American women in Congress. She was elected in the recent, so she's now in Congress. And Charisse is a dynamo. She's like a black belt or something like that. You don't want to mess with Charisse.
She was an MMA fighter.
Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah, she's fabulous. She's incredible. So, so this regenerative community, they own 34 acres. It's a $60 million development. I think last I checked, there were about 13 homes that had been built. There's some sweat equity. People can save money by helping to build their own homes. They did start a women's quilting cooperative. I was fortunate enough to buy one of these quilts before the quilting cooperative went under, I'm sorry to say. So there are failures. Ted and I made some mistakes. I'm going to tell just a very quick story. We thought our job was to come in and lecture these people. Here's how you do economic development, blah, 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 blah. Well, our very first meeting, they basically threw us out of the room and said, we need to talk to each other. We need to figure out what it is that we want. And about 2 hours later, when we sat in the hall and cooled our heels with our funder, a couple hours later, they brought us in and they said, okay, this is how it's going to be. We're going to do co-learning. This is not about you lecturing us. We're doing co-learning here. And we did. And we would go around the country. We would visit different spaces and see who's doing cool things around the country. We would bring in experts who could, just in time, because we worked with a half dozen Native American groups who were all doing things. Anyway, we learned a lot. They learned a lot. And Nick is inspiring people all over the country. So this work is being taken out by Native Americans to other Native American groups. So it's one of the most amazing things that we had ever been part of. And it's about building different kinds of wealth and doing it differently. Now, at one point, one of the women we worked with said, people were saying, well, we need businesses in these business spaces, so let's go get some franchises. And she said, no, we need Native-owned businesses, right? We don't want just some white people to come in. They didn't want white businesses to come in and do all the construction and run off with all the wealth, right? So they're very, very deliberate about that. So that's one story. It's 7:30. You want to tell another story, Ted?
I'll just give you one. First, I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. I know there's a Clevelander back there. There always seems to be a Clevelander in every audience. It's like where Ohioans are like the Irish. The great diaspora of Ohioans are everywhere. I was in Amarillo, Texas, lecturing. I said, is anybody here from Cleveland? Yeah, there was somebody in the audience on the high plains of Texas. And in Cleveland, we've started the Evergreen cooperatives, and if you want to know about that, we could talk about that. But I wanted to share with you actually the last chapter of the book, and then maybe we'll open it up to questions.
Sure.
And it's about a place called Preston, England, which is a really, really interesting story. And very briefly, Preston, some historians say the Industrial Revolution actually began in Preston. If not, it began right nearby. So Preston was an older industrial city, what we call a Rust Belt city, not very big, 150,000 people, but it had a total collapse of the local economy. When I first went there in 2012 and went down the high street, it was just building after building, store after store boarded up. I mean, a very depressed place. There was almost no economic activity going on, very high unemployment and so forth. And so what they decided to do in Preston, since the national government, the Tories, were certainly not going to help them, and in fact, the Tory government, as you know, has imposed austerity, which has just hammered the budgets of local authorities to be able to do anything, in the name of we have to, pay our own way and so forth. So what Preston said is, okay, no one's coming to save us. How do we build an economy here that will really work for us and change the dynamic locally? And so what they set out to do has become widely reported in the United Kingdom now as the Preston model, even reported on pretty favorably in The Economist, which is not known for this sort of thing, which called this Preston Jeremy Corbyn's favorite town. And so what happened in Preston, a very dynamic young city councilor organized a bunch of what we call anchor institutions, the University of Central Lancashire, Public Housing Authority, the City Council, the police authority, and so forth, and convinced them all to look at their purchasing and start to move contracts that were going internationally to multinationals or down to what's called the City in London, their version of Wall Street, and start to systematically move contracts back into the city on the theory that there's a lot of money being spent, it's just exiting the system, so they're not getting any multiplier effect. So in 5 years, they've now what they call repatriated over 70 million pounds of spending back into the city of Preston. Then the city has made a commitment to use 100 million pounds of its public employee pension funds, which is just a small percentage, and invest them, again, not in the city, but in building local housing, youth programs, and so forth. So that's 100 million pounds coming back into the city. Then the University of Central Lancashire has looked at the local economy and see where are there gaps in the market where new business development could be done. And UCLan has created an co-op incubator to build what they call gap co-ops. Again, starting small, 5 people in this one, 7 people in this one, but to start to build worker cooperatives in the city. They're now looking at establishing a public bank, the Bank of Lancashire, they're in Lancashire County, which would be capitalized by the reserves of the City Council and the County Council of Lancashire, so that they will have control over their own source of capital. They became the first living wage city in all of the north of the United Kingdom, the City Council paying a living wage. Then the City Council persuaded all of their other anchor partners, like the University of Central Lancashire and the police and so forth, to become living wage employers for all of their people. And now they're negotiating with their vendors to say, look, our values are to pay a family supporting living wage. If you want to do business with us, we want you to start to move to paying your employees a living wage as well. There are other aspects to this model, but the end result of this is sort of the final piece of the story, is that when this began in 2012, that's the first time I went to Preston, we started talking about these ideas, so it really kicked off in 2013. Preston was listed in the Brits keep what's called the Index of Deprivation. How about that? For an uplifting term. Preston was in the bottom 20% of the most deprived communities in all of the United Kingdom. In 5 years, earlier this year, this very far-left radical group you may have heard of called PricewaterhouseCoopers did an assessment of the most improved communities in the United Kingdom, and Preston was rated number 1. So now there's a huge distance to go, so I'm not saying this is paradise. But in 5 years, with the intentional application of a strategy for building community wealth and the use of the many kinds of tools that are reported in this book and others, they have been able to start to really build a resilient local economy where their wealth is not being sucked out of their system. As a result of this, Jeremy Corbyn has established in his office the Community Wealth Building Unit. It's become a major program of labor, and there are 35 cities around the United Kingdom starting to develop these models, as well as in Wales, as well as in Scotland. So something very interesting is happening in the United Kingdom, as are very interesting things in this country. And the final thing I'd say is I take some inspiration in the possibility that our two countries, England and the United States, that is where in 1979, 80, that period, the neoliberal agenda was given birth and then sort of weaponized through getting rid of government regulation, destroying the miners' union in the United Kingdom, the air traffic controllers in the United States, and on and on and on. And then that radical agenda that's led to so much wealth concentration swept the world. We live in a global, hyper-capitalist economy that is a neoliberal economy. Some call it casino capitalism. That where this all began was in our two countries literally 40 years ago, right now. And it may be possible that in our country and in England now, this new vision of a democratic economy is being born. So that possibly where it all went radically off the rails, maybe those two places are part of the solution to give birth to a very, very significantly different paradigm that hopefully will have an even more powerful and certainly more beneficial impact on the world. Any last word, Marjorie?
No, that's great, Ted. I'd love to take some questions from the audience. What are people thinking?
And I think, Peter, you're going to run a mic?
Yes,
Great.
if you have a question, just raise your hand and I will bring the mic. I'll try to
Okay,
go in a
good.
loop around the room.
Hi, I'm Kathy Mulder. I'm a professor at John Jay College in economics. My question to you is, you were talking about Evergreen and lately, I do work in economic democracy. So lately, I've been trying to find out what the heck is going on with Evergreen and their relationship with the steel workers. And I'm not finding anything without like going there, you know. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, well,
Thank
there's
you.
actually no relationship I'm aware of with the steel workers. What had happened was, excuse me, 5, 6, 7 years ago, Mondragon in the Basque region of Spain, many of you will have heard of, sort of the very large worker cooperative movement, formulated an MOU with the steelworkers, so it's Mondragon, to build unionized worker cooperatives in the United States. I don't know where that stands, but it didn't have anything to do with Evergreen. No. The interest is, for those of you who don't know, what we created in Cleveland was we leveraged the supply chain purchasing of the 3 big public nonprofit institutions in Cleveland, Case Western Reserve University, University Hospitals, and Cleveland Clinic, to try to drive contracts locally and use them to help build a network of for-profit worker-owned businesses in low-income neighborhoods that hire people who've been unemployed. And this is called the Evergreen Cooperatives. There are 5 or 6 of these companies now. There are about close to 300 people working, receiving living wage jobs, health benefits, and so forth, and also profit sharing. Interestingly, this was a great triumph earlier this year. We have what's called the Evergreen Cooperative Laundry. It does healthcare bed linen. And we were doing about 8 million pounds of laundry, which is a lot, right? And 50 people were employed. Hard work, not sexy work, but you can make a living for your family. And the Cleveland Clinic, which had all of its 20 million pounds of laundry done by Sodexo, a multinational out of France, that contract came up for bidding. And Sodexo put in a bid, and this feisty green worker co-op called Evergreen put in a bid, and we went toe-to-toe, and we won all of the Cleveland Clinic's business. So we pulled that contract away from Sodexo, and it's now, we're running all the Cleveland Clinic's laundry. So Evergreen is one of the largest healthcare bed linen providers in the state, worker co-op. Thank you.
That's great. Uh-huh.
Oh, we had
over
another one
there?
over here, and then I'll come to you next.
Hi, thank you for being here and doing this. My name is David Wu. I'm on the board of my food co-op in Philadelphia. And one thing I haven't seen in the cooperative world in terms of linking economic democracy to something important, I haven't seen anybody link economic democracy to our political democracy as a foundation in terms of being able to help people connect the dots as to why it's an important aspect and a foundational aspect, because we're all too busy trying to make it that we don't have the time for civic engagement. And if we were a little bit more wealthy with the luxury of time, and if there are more poor people doing that, that might be a better opportunity to help the journalists who don't get it make that connection on why economic democracy is important. Have you thought about this? And I'd also like to ask the deputy mayor, where are the city's operational day-to-day deposits right now? Which bank are they deposited with? And if there's a possibility of creating a public bank or putting monies into credit unions as a means to leverage what the city's doing, all those big banks are getting incredible fees for the city's deposits. And if there's a possibility of doing something with that to capitalize cooperatives that we've been working on, because it's not easy.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, Ted talked about Preston, and one of the things that we're seeing in the UK is how do you build a politics around this? It really is being built there, and Corbyn could well be, after Boris, he could well be the next prime minister. So they're talking about community wealth building. Sometimes they use the phrase democratic economy. Sometimes they use the phrase socialism. I personally don't think that word will fly as well in the U.S. But that you can build a politics around this, and it is happening. And we wanted to talk just for a minute about some of what's happening in New York. I mean, you know, with the blackouts with Con Ed, people are starting to say, well, maybe there should be a publicly owned utility here instead of investor owned. So there's some talk about that. There's also, the mayor has done a lot, put millions of dollars into building worker co-ops. There's, I think, really a nationally inspiring movement here for worker co-ops being built, and the city has led that, putting millions of dollars into that. There is a movement here for a public bank. People, you may have heard, who's heard of the Bank of North Dakota? I'm just curious if people have heard of that. It's a state-owned bank. It's owned by the people at state. Because of that bank, it's almost like a mini Federal Reserve in the state. It supports lots of locally owned banks, and there's about 5 times as many locally owned banks in that state per capita as other states because of this bank. It allowed that state to weather the 2008 downturn much better than other states, and it's created a movement nationwide for public banks. The new governor of California campaigned on a platform of creating a public bank. So, and there's some talk of that going on here. There's a movement for that in Boston, too. There's a whole Bronx cooperative development initiative here, working with, Ted talked about anchors, using our anchor institutions, places that are not going to get up and leave, they're not going to globalize themselves, that they're anchored in place. And can we localize some of that purchasing, that investing, that hiring to benefit local communities? So there's some of that going on here with a racial equity lens. Yeah, so this idea of publicly owned power. You know, right now we have investor-owned utilities in lots of areas, and they tend to block dealing with climate change because it threatens their business model. I mean, we can move, as we move to green energy, we could also move to distributed ownership. It's much more natural. You don't need to have everything centralized, but of course that threatens the business model. But that's an example of how we need to not only green the technologies of our economy, we need to actually change the social architectures, the financial architectures of the economy. So this goes into lots of different spheres, and there's a lot happening here in New York. And there was 2 groups that we wanted to mention in particular.
Yeah, we just wanted to give a shout out to our friends at the Cooperative Economics Alliance of New York City, some of whom of you are here. There they are in the back. Thank you.
Okay, great.
And also the New York City Network of Worker Cooperatives. They've helped us organize this event. I know we need more questions. I did just want to address the one point you made about the sort of linkage of this to our civic life and democratic life in this country. First, as Phil began saying, you know, we believe this is a movement to take the principles of democracy, which were there at the heart of the beginning of this country, although very imperfectly implemented, and move the principles of democracy into the economy itself. That we need to not think of the economy as just markets, but that it is our economy, and that we have the right to expect an economy that actually has a democratic participation element in it. The other thing I want to say to your question is there can be a worker co-op that's a wonderful worker co-op. If it doesn't have a vision beyond simply benefiting the members of the co-op in that business, then that company ultimately could be no better than any other capitalist company. We need to have designs that explicitly link the rights and the value for the workers and the owners of the capital with the rights and the benefit of the community. And that's why in organizing Evergreen, we created companies that really have two measures of whether they're successful. One is, are they profitable for the workers, and are the members of the co-op, each of whom has a share, are they benefiting themselves? But that's insufficient. The second is, are those companies creating the same opportunity for others in the community to move into a cooperative democratic economy? And so therefore, every Evergreen company makes a commitment to stream 10% of their profits to a holding company to seed the development of new companies, so that there's a mission beyond the company itself. We'll have to take that, I think, offline and give someone else an opportunity, but it's a good question.
We got a question right over here.
So thank you very much for having these attitudes and bringing, what I think the human element to the very impersonal world. I mean, if you look at the trajectory and go back more than 40 years, but the 40 years before that, you see what I think would have been more or less a democratic kind of, I mean, there's lots of ownership, lots of small companies everywhere, everything was local. And that, in those 40 years, that's, it ended up with a bunch of big companies. And that's where the neoliberalism comes in. So my question is, we're really trying to go back to a place where there's much more local ownership, local working. At the same time, we've got massive problems going in. And what do you see as the time frame for being able to realize a world that actually works in relation to the real problems we're facing, the real attitudes people have, and the real power that the corporations have, and the misinformation that's everywhere?
Yep. Well, let me try this. So our co-founder at the Democracy Collaborative is, many of you will have read his work. His name's Gar Alperovitz. He's a historian and political economist. And as Gar says, and he's been doing this work since the early 60s, as Gar says, the ticket to play this game of this kind of transformation is decades of your life on the table. So what we're talking about is not a transformation that comes about tomorrow. What this book points to is innovations and models that start to unlock the imagination. I mean, the real issue is, can we make the changes we need to make in the face of the climate catastrophe that's coming at us? And I don't think anybody has the answer to that, but we need to keep going forward in doing this work. I think this system is demonstrating an inability to deal with the big trends that the system itself are causing. The climate catastrophe, growing wealth inequality. There are things going on now that are literally going to tear us apart as England is being torn apart. And so, we don't know actually if this is going to go to the right or the left. We're seeing some pretty dark stuff happening right now. A lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it related to the incredible inequality of this system and what people are feeling. But nonetheless, I think we keep driving forward because, Milton Friedman, God bless him, said, it's a very good thing to develop ideas powerfully that may not get a hearing yet, but they're just left around. And then when the politics change, they can move very rapidly into scale and into power. And I think we need to be prepared.
Yeah.
When the politics change, do we have the body of ideas and the systemic analysis to move boldly forward?
Yeah, and let me just add to that, just to amplify what Ted said, and that is that before the New Deal, there were some very small kind of laboratories of democracy, they were called. For example, Alaska decided, this was in the depths of the Depression, well, let's give some money to old people. We don't want old people going hungry. And that was the idea that became Social Security. right? So you don't necessarily start a few little things and then a few more things. There can be great leaps. So you can have laboratories that show a model, that prove a concept, and then you can apply it at scale. And let me give you 2 examples of those that we talk about some in the book and our organization works on. One is what we call quantitative easing for the planet. And this is a big idea that GAR developed, and our colleague Carla Scandier has built it out. And I'll start by saying there was a contest for big ideas for how do we deal with climate, right? And there were some funders who came together. The idea was ending the age of oil. And they got 600 ideas from around the world. And there were 3 that received funding. And this idea was one. This was one of these. Some very sophisticated people said, that's an out-of-the-box idea. And the idea is, what if we bought out the 25 largest fossil fuel companies, bought 51% of them, and said, we're going to wind you down. We're going to own you, and we're going to wind you down. You're going to have a new purpose. This is what we talk about, what the purpose and ownership of enterprises matters. Well, here's a dramatic example of that. The purpose of these enterprises is now to preserve life on Earth. What would that cost? We ran some calculations. Mid-year 2018, it would cost $700 billion. And now, that's a lot of money, right? But go back, spread it over 7 years, and it's 100 billion a year, and it's not quite as much. Go back to, was it 2008, 2009, and there was Hank Paulson on his knees in front of Nancy Pelosi begging for a bailout of the big banks. What was the number? It was 700 billion. He got it in the blink of an eye, and far more. And the question is, what do we consider a crisis? If the banks are in crisis, if the capital owners of those banks are going to lose money, that's a crisis, and we're going to act overnight. What if the planet is in trouble? Is that a crisis? I mean, this is the nature of what we're talking about. Is it only the capital that matters? That's the nature of an extractive economy. And so can we say that, no, something else actually comes first, like maybe life on Earth comes first? So that's one of the ideas that we talk about in the book. And let me just throw another one on the table that we have our colleague Thomas Hanna is working on. And that is, okay, so when we bailed out the big banks, right? They essentially became publicly owned. AIG became publicly owned. Royal Bank of Scotland is still in public ownership in UK. There's an argument to say, let's break it up into a bunch of smaller banks. Well, if the next time, so we took over these banks and then we, just basically gave it back. We didn't demand anything different of them. So this time, if we have to bail out the big banks, they should become publicly owned permanently, meaning owned by the people, owned by the government. So we put out a big, thick report on this. And this is what Ted is saying. What are the ideas that are laying around, that seem impossible today, but when the right crisis comes, might just be possible? So no, it's not just all little local stuff. It also has to be big stuff. So I'm wondering if we should sign a few books here. It's about 5 to 8.
If we can take
Peter,
one more over here.
One more?
Yeah.
Sure.
My question's a little complicated, but I'll try to make it brief. If we envision at some point in the future having some form of industrial democracy existing in many industries, from what you've described it's not going to simply be a matter of procedure. It's going to be a matter of commitment to certain ideological ideals and a certain concept of almost human rights and relations like that, which, although it will, I'm sure, unlock many opportunities, it will imply constraints on what the leadership, the hopefully elected leadership of companies are able to do. And the companies that are trying to pioneer this new model of democratic industry, this anti-capitalist model, are going to be up against firms that have no particular qualms against automation and against outsourcing and price gouging and negotiating favorable trade deals, using insider influence, paying the bare minimum to their workforces. And to somebody like me, it seems very hard to believe that they would not see the rise of a model like this as an existential threat to their power. What will happen when that scenario comes to pass? How do you respond to that?
Look, you cannot reconstruct, or you cannot construct a political economy like ours to move, let's say, beyond capitalism as we know it. You can't, I don't believe, construct it simply with a bunch of grassroots models and keep scaling them and then get some legislation in and some politicians that think that I'm for all of that. Ultimately, this has got to move seriously into politics. We're talking about the strongest force on the face of the planet and maybe in the history of the planet, and there's going to need to be a serious political movement to challenge what we call in the book the bias toward capital. I don't know how that's going to get negotiated. It's very difficult because what used to constrain runaway capital in this country was the fact that we had an organized labor movement. It was never as big as Europe's, but at the peak, 35% of the American workforce was unionized. But that was back in the 1950s. The private sector union participation now is 6%. And there's not a lot of reason to think it's going to rebound. So what we have now, instead of labor keeping capital in some sort of constraint and winning victories for working people, what we have now is capital with no constraint at all. And there's going to need to be built a powerful movement aimed at that. And how that all plays out, I don't know. That's the part of history. But I do know, as we say in the book, and it's not our quote, it's from someone else, that we have got to unlock our imagination around this because it is easier to envision the end of the planet than it is to envision the end of capitalism. And that is a damning statement, and it is true. So we have got to understand we live in a system. And if we had lived in Pharaoh's Egypt 3,000 years ago, which went on a couple thousand years, I know we would be sitting there going, there are always going to be pyramids and sphinxes and pharaohs and priests and serfs, peasants. And now we study that multi-thousand-year system in the British Museum. And if we lived in the Middle Ages, we'd think there's always going to be the king and the royalty and the church. And so these systems come and go. How this one plays out, I don't know. But I do know it's important to lift up the innovations, the models that we point to in this book, and project them toward people and say, look, this is a different way that's possible. Working people can control their workplace. It works. It demonstrably does. Cities can control their capital. They don't need to beg the big banks to get loans, on and on and on. So we need to do that sort of big public education, but ultimately it moves into politics. And luckily, you're a young enough man that you'll probably see how this plays out, and I wish you well.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for your questions.
Thank you very much.
And
You've just
thank
been
you,
great.
Ted, Mark.
If he wants to sign books, we're happy to do it. Thanks.